Grace Whittaker dug her heels into the wooden platform and wrapped both arms tighter around Lucy, who was screaming so hard her little face had gone red as a wound. Emma and Samuel pressed against Grace's sides, fingers twisting into the fabric of her skirt, and Grace could feel them shaking. Both of them, shaking the way people shake when they know something terrible is about to happen, and there's nothing left to do but hold on. The auctioneer's voice cut through the crowd noise like a blade. Widow woman, 2 girls, 1 boy. Who opens at 15. If this story moves something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel right now and follow along until the very end, because this story is going to go places you don't expect. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to us. Now let's go back to Wyoming 1888 and find out what really happened on that platform. The summer of 1888 came to Millhaven, Wyoming, like it always did, hard and fast and without apology. The sun pressed down on the town square with the kind of heat that made wood swell and tempers shorten, and by the time the crowd gathered near the courthouse steps, there were already more than 60 people standing in the dust, fanning themselves with their hats and talking in low, eager voices, the way people talk when they've come to watch something they know they probably shouldn't enjoy. Grace Whittaker had not slept in 3 days. She stood at the back of the sheriff's wagon with Lucy balanced on her left hip and her right hand gripping Samuel's wrist so tight the boy winced but didn't say a word. Emma stood just ahead of them, her back straight and her chin lifted the way Grace had always taught her. Hold yourself up, baby girl, no matter what. But Grace could see the trembling in Emma's thin shoulders, and she knew her daughter was fighting just as hard as she was. The debt was $412. That was what her husband Robert's cousins had decided she owed them. Robert had been dead 11 weeks. He'd fallen from the barn roof trying to repair a section that had been rotting since the previous winter, and he'd been gone before Grace even reached him in the yard. 11 weeks, and already his cousins had arrived at her door with a county deed transfer and a debt notice signed by a judge. Grace had never met, claiming Robert had borrowed against the property years before their marriage. Claiming she was responsible. Claiming the children's inheritance had been signed over as collateral. Grace had fought it. She'd hired the only lawyer in Millhaven willing to take her case, a decent man named Porter, who'd spent 2 weeks reviewing the documents before coming to her kitchen table and sitting down with the expression of a man about to deliver a sentence. Mrs. Whittaker, he'd said quietly, these documents appear to be in order. I have concerns, but I cannot prove forgery without access to the original county ledgers, and the Harlan family controls the county clerk's office. Short of a miracle, the judgment will stand. What does that mean for my children? Porter had looked at the table. It means they can collect the debt by any legal means available, including labor contracts. She hadn't understood what that meant until the morning Deputy Crane arrived at her door with 2 men she'd never seen before and told her she had 1 hour to gather the children and come quietly, or he'd come back with 6 men and she'd come not so quietly. She'd packed a single bag. She'd told Emma to hold Lucy. She'd taken Samuel's hand and walked out of the only home her children had ever known, and she had not looked back because she knew if she looked back, she would fall apart, and she did not have the luxury of falling apart. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The auction platform was nothing more than 2 wooden crates, stacked and covered with a board set up near the center of the square where everyone could see. Grace stepped up onto it when the deputy told her to, and felt the wood shift beneath her weight. Lucy immediately buried her face against Grace's neck and made a sound that wasn't quite crying, more like the sound of a small creature that had run out of places to run. Easy, baby, Grace murmured. I've got you. Mama's got you. Mama. Samuel's voice was very quiet and very tight. What are they going to do? They're going to find someone to pay off the debt, Grace said. She kept her voice level. She kept her face still. And then we're going to go with that person for a while and work. That's all. We're going to work. Together. Together. She said it with everything she had. We stay together. Do you hear me, Samuel James Whittaker? We stay together. The auctioneer, a wide, red-faced man named Dobbins, who ran the feed store and apparently also ran whatever passed for a labor auction in Millhaven, climbed up onto the platform beside her, and raised both hands to quiet the crowd. "All right, folks, all right. We got a simple contract situation here. Widow woman, 4 years labor contract skills include cooking, sewing, livestock care, and household management. 3 children, girl of 8, boy of 6, infant girl age 2. Bidding opens at $15 per annum on the contract." Someone in the crowd laughed. Grace kept her eyes straight ahead. "Now, I want to be clear," Dobbins continued, his voice dropping into the practiced tone of a man who'd done this before and found a way to make it sound reasonable. "The debt is $412. We're looking for one contract or multiple. We can discuss arrangements. Can you separate the children?" The voice came from the left side of the crowd. A heavy-set rancher named Cutler Grace knew him slightly, had bought supplies from Robert once or twice. He was looking at her the way he might look at livestock. "Legally speaking, the children are part of the contract package," Dobbins said carefully. "However, with the widow's consent, she won't consent." Grace said it loud enough for the whole square to hear. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. "I won't consent to that under any circumstances. We are not being separated. Take that off the table." Cutler's expression soured. "Woman, you don't exactly have a negotiating position here." "Maybe not, but I have a voice, and I intend to use it." She shifted Lucy higher on her hip and looked directly at Cutler. "You want to bid on my labor? You bid on my family. That's the only deal I'm offering." There was a ripple of reaction through the crowd. Some of it was surprise, some of it was contempt. A few of the women standing near the back exchanged glances that Grace couldn't quite read. Dobbins cleared his throat. "Well, moving along. Do we have an opening bid of $15 per annum for the full family contract?" Silence. Then from the right side of the crowd, "I'll take the woman. Leave the older 2 with the county home and let someone else deal with the baby." Grace felt Emma grab her hand from behind. She felt Samuel go rigid against her side. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. "No," she said again. "That's not a bid. That's a fantasy." More laughter from the crowd. But this time, it was uncomfortable laughter, the kind that comes when people aren't quite sure who to be uncomfortable for. $20 a year, said a thin man near the front named Beasley, who ran a laundry operation outside of town. "I'll take the woman and the boy. The boy's old enough to work. I'll place the girls with the county." "No." Grace's voice was iron. "No, we don't split up. I will walk off this platform right now and let the sheriff drag me back in chains before I let anyone take one of my children from me. Is that clear?" Deputy Crane stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitaker, is that clear?" She wasn't speaking to Crane anymore. She was speaking to the crowd. She was speaking to every person who had gathered in the heat to watch a woman and her children be broken apart for $400 of fraud. "You want to buy my labor, you keep my family whole. Any man who thinks he can separate us is going to spend the next 4 years fighting a woman who has nothing left to lose. Think carefully about whether that's what you want." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Grace had ever heard. Dobbins mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Well, the lady seems to have a strong preference for 25 a year, woman only. I'll sort out the children with the county myself." The voice belonged to a man named Garvey, who ran cattle north of town and had a reputation Grace didn't like. She turned to find him in the crowd and met his eyes directly and did not look away. "No," she said quietly. "Try again." Garvey's face reddened. "You are in no position." "No." "Lady, the law says." "I know what the law says. I also know what I'll do if you put those children in a county home." She held his gaze. Her arms tightened around Lucy. "Test me." Something shifted in Garvey's expression. Not respect, not quite, but something like the recognition of a wall he hadn't expected to find. The crowd was murmuring now, and the murmur was changing. There was something uncomfortable moving through it, something that hadn't been there at the beginning, something that sounded almost like doubt. Cutler tried again. $50 up front, woman and boy. Girls go to the Harlan family estate as household help. Emma made a small sound behind Grace. Grace reached back without looking and found her daughter's hand. "Not for $1,000, Grace said. "Not for 10,000. You don't buy some of us. You don't get to offer me money to hand over my daughters. No amount of money makes that a real choice." "Then you'll stay on that platform until dark," Cutler said. "Because nobody's taking on 3 children with a labor contract. Then I'll stand here until dark." She squared her shoulders. Lucy had stopped crying. She was watching the crowd with her wide, dark eyes like she understood something the adults hadn't figured out yet. "I'll stand here as long as it takes." The laughter that came next was different from the earlier laughter. It was mean. It was the kind of laughter people use when they want to break something down. Grace heard it and felt it and let it pass through her like wind through a fence. She was still standing. Then from the very back of the crowd, where the shade from the feed store awning reached the edge of the square, a voice rose above the noise. It wasn't loud. That was the first thing that struck her. It wasn't the bellow of a man trying to be heard over a crowd. It was quiet, measured and completely certain, the voice of a man who had decided something and was simply announcing it. $412. Everything stopped. Dobbins blinked. "I'm sorry. $412. The voice again, calm as water. "That's the debt, isn't it? The full amount? I'll pay it." The crowd parted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way crowds part when something unexpected is moving through them, when people step aside, not because they were asked to, but because something about the presence passing through them suggests they'd better. The man who walked toward the platform was not remarkable to look at, not at first. He was tall and lean in the way of men who work hard outdoors, with the kind of quiet that settles into a person's bones after years spent mostly alone. He wore a dark vest over a worn work shirt, a hat that had seen better decades, and the kind of boots that had walked a great many miles across a great many kinds of ground. He was perhaps 35, perhaps older. His face was weathered and unreadable. Grace had never seen him before in her life. He stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at her, not at Dobbins, not at the crowd, at her. "My name is Ethan Callahan," he said. "I run a ranch up in the high country, Pine Ridge, about 12 miles north of here." He paused. "I'll pay the full debt, all $412. Dobbins found his voice. "Mr. Callahan, the contract terms would require—" "I'm not interested in a contract," Ethan said. The crowd went very still. "I beg your pardon," Dobbins said. "I said I'm not interested in a contract." Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced an envelope, which he held up without opening. "I'm paying the debt. The debt gets paid, the legal obligation ends. Mrs. Whitaker and her children are free of it. That's how debt works." Cutler took a step forward. "That's not how this works, Callahan. There's a labor contract attached. Show me where the law requires a labor contract when the debt is paid in full." Ethan's voice was still quiet. His eyes moved to Cutler with the calm attention of a man who isn't angry, but also isn't interested in being argued with. "Show me the statute. I'll wait." Cutler opened his mouth, closed it. "There's no such statute," Ethan said simply. "Because there is no such law. The debt can be paid outright. I'm paying it outright." He looked back at Grace. "If Mrs. Whitaker chooses." The crowd erupted. Not in approval, in confusion, in argument, in the loud, complicated noise of people who had come to watch one thing and were now watching something entirely different. Grace stared at the man at the bottom of the platform. "Why?" she asked. She didn't mean to say it out loud. It came out before she could stop it. Ethan looked at her steadily. "Because I have $412 and no particular use for it, and because this isn't right." A pause. "Ma'am, you don't know me." "No, ma'am, I don't." "You don't know my children." "No, but I watched you stand up there for 40 minutes and refused to let them split your family apart." Something moved through his expression, brief and carefully controlled. "I reckon I know enough." Grace looked at him for a long moment. Lucy had turned her head and was watching the stranger with her big, solemn eyes. Samuel had gone completely still. Emma's grip on Grace's hand had tightened to the point of pain. "What do you want in return?" Grace asked. "Nothing you're not willing to give," Ethan said. "I've got a big house and not enough people in it. I've got a ranch that needs tending. I could use the help if you're willing." He paused. "But nothing is required, Mrs. Whitaker. You pay me back when you can, or you don't pay me back at all. Either way, you're free of this." Dobbins cleared his throat loudly. "Now hold on just a moment. Deputy Crane?" Ethan turned to the deputy without raising his voice. "Is there a law against a man paying another person's debt in full and releasing them from obligation?" Crane looked deeply uncomfortable. He looked at Dobbins. He looked at Cutler. He looked at the envelope in Ethan Callahan's hand. "No," he said finally. "No, there ain't. Then we're done here." Ethan reached up his hand, not to Grace, not demanding, not presuming. He simply extended it the way you extend a hand to someone standing on unsteady ground, offered and waiting, the decision entirely hers. Grace looked at that hand for 3 full seconds. Then she looked down at Lucy, who was watching the stranger with an expression that was almost curious. She looked at Samuel, whose jaw was set tight and whose eyes were bright with something that might have been hope, or might have been fear. She'd learned those two things sometimes looked identical in children. She looked at Emma, who gave the smallest nod Grace had ever seen. Grace Whitaker shifted Lucy to her right hip, reached down and took Ethan Callahan's hand. The crowd noise swelled around them. Cutler was shouting something. Garvey was appealing to the deputy. Dobbins was consulting papers with the frantic energy of a man looking for a rule that might undo what had just happened. Ethan helped her down from the platform, steadied her when she reached the ground, and released her hand the moment she was steady. Then he crouched down right there in the middle of the square, with the whole town watching, until he was at eye level with Emma and Samuel. He looked at Emma first. "My name is Ethan Callahan. I know you don't have any reason to trust me. I'm not asking you to." He held her gaze. "I'm just asking for a chance." Emma stared at him with 8-year-old eyes that had already seen too much. She didn't speak. He turned to Samuel. "You like horses?" Samuel blinked. Of all the things he'd expected a stranger to say, that apparently was not it. Yes, sir. Got a bay gelding named of Cooper who is frankly the stubbornest animal I've ever owned, and he needs a person with patience. You think you might be interested in meeting him?" Samuel looked at Grace. Grace gave the smallest nod she had. "Yeah," Samuel said. "Yeah, I think so." Ethan stood back up and looked at Lucy, who had been studying him the entire time with an unsettlingly direct gaze. For a moment, neither of them did anything. Then Lucy reached out one small hand and grabbed the front of his vest. Something happened in Ethan Callahan's face. It was subtle, and he controlled it quickly, but Grace saw it, a crack in the careful composure, a flash of something raw and old and aching gone almost before it arrived. He gently covered Lucy's small hand with one of his large ones and didn't move it away. "Well," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "All right then." Grace watched him. She had spent 28 years learning to read people, and she had learned to be deeply skeptical of kindness that arrived without a cost. She did not trust this man. She did not know this man. She had no earthly reason to follow him 12 miles into the high country with her 3 children and the single bag she'd packed that morning. But she also knew what the alternative looked like. She'd been standing on a wooden platform, watching it arrive from every direction. She pulled Samuel close and took Emma's hand and said very quietly, "We're going to Pine Ridge Ranch. We're going to be careful. We're going to watch and wait, and not make any decisions we can't walk back from." She looked at each of her children in turn. "Understood." Emma nodded. Samuel nodded. Lucy grabbed Ethan's vest a little tighter. Grace straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and turned to face Ethan Callahan. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I need you to understand something before we go anywhere." "Yes, ma'am?" "I am not property. My children are not property. Whatever arrangement we make, it will be made between 2 people who are equal in it, or it will not be made at all." Ethan held her gaze without blinking. "Agreed." And if at any point I decide this isn't right for my family, we walk. No arguments, no debts called in, no complications." "Agreed. And my children's names are Emma Samuel and Lucy. Not the girl, the boy, and the baby. Emma Samuel and Lucy." For the first time, something moved across Ethan Callahan's face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Emma Samuel and Lucy," he repeated. "I've got it." Grace studied him for one more long moment. Then, "All right, Mr. Callahan. Lead the way." She didn't look back at the crowd. She didn't look back at the platform, or the deputy or Dobbin still shuffling his useless papers. She walked forward with her children beside her, and a stranger she didn't know leading the way to a future she couldn't see, and she told herself that uncertainty was survivable. She had survived worse. The wagon ride to Pine Ridge took most of the afternoon winding up through pine-shadowed trails that grew cooler and quieter as Millhaven fell away behind them. Ethan drove. Grace sat in the wagon bed with the children, and nobody said much because nobody knew yet what to say. Samuel watched the trees with wide, careful eyes. Emma kept her face turned outward, watching the trail, and Grace understood that her daughter was calculating distances and exits the same way she was. Lucy fell asleep against Grace's shoulder somewhere around the 2nd mile, and stayed that way, one hand still loosely curled as if reaching for something in her sleep. Ethan said, after a long stretch of quiet, "I should tell you about the house." Grace looked at the back of his head. "What about it?" "It's large, more rooms than I use. I built it bigger than I needed because I thought—" He paused. "It doesn't matter why. The point is, there's space. Emma and Lucy can share a room if that's comfortable, or they can have separate rooms. Samuel can have the room near the barn if he wants to be close to the horses. You'd have your own room." Another pause. "Your own room with a lock on the door." Grace felt something in her chest ease very slightly, like a knot that had been pulled so tight for so long she'd forgotten it was a knot at all. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll write up a contract tonight," Ethan said. "Plain language, nothing hidden. You can have Porter in town look it over if you want, or find another lawyer or not sign it at all. But I want it clear in writing that this arrangement is your choice, not an obligation." Emma, who had been pretending to watch the trees, turned her head slightly. Grace caught the movement. "How long have you been at Pine Ridge?" Grace asked. 8 years, Ethan said. "Alone?" "Mostly." He guided the horses around a rock in the trail. "I've got 2 ranch hands. Hector and Pete. They bunk in the south cabin. They're good men, quiet, work hard, mind their own business. I'll introduce you." A beat. "They know how to treat people right. I wouldn't keep them on if they didn't." Samuel leaned forward. "Mr. Callahan, is Cooper there?" "He is." "Is he really stubborn?" "Boy, that horse has opinions about everything. The time of day he gets fed, which direction the wind is blowing, whether I've combed him correctly. He let me know last Tuesday that he disapproved of my choice of saddle blanket." Samuel blinked. Then he laughed, a small, genuine, startled laugh that Grace hadn't heard from her son in 11 weeks. She stored it carefully. She folded it up and put it somewhere safe inside herself. When Pine Ridge Ranch came into view around the last bend of the trail, Grace looked at it with the eyes of a woman who had learned to assess shelter the way soldiers assess terrain. The main house was large and solid, built from timber that had been cut and cured properly, sitting on a slight rise with good sight lines in multiple directions. The barn was clean and well maintained. The fencing was in good repair. There were chickens in an orderly pen and a kitchen garden that was producing, and the whole place had the particular quality of a property that was cared for even when nobody was watching. She looked at it, and something loosened in her chest. Hector met them at the gate, a compact, sun-darkened man of perhaps 40, with a hat he held in both hands, and eyes that moved from Grace to the children, and back with careful, uncomplicated kindness. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Ma'am, it's a pleasure. Pete's getting dinner started. Nothing fancy, but it's hot." "That's more than enough," Grace said. "Thank you." She carried Lucy inside. Emma and Samuel followed, and Grace Whitaker crossed the threshold of Pine Ridge Ranch, holding her baby and her breath, and the particular fragile thing she'd been carrying since the moment she stepped onto that platform. The iron-willed refusal to break the stubborn insistence that her family would stay whole, and set it down just for a moment, just long enough to let herself feel the solid floor beneath her feet. She didn't trust this yet. She didn't know this man. She wasn't safe, and she knew it, and she would watch and wait and stay ready to move the moment she had to. But the floor was solid. The house was warm, and somewhere outside she could hear Samuel asking Ethan about the horse. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and listened to her son's voice, and for the first time in 11 weeks, she let herself cry quickly. One hand pressed flat against her sternum because she was still standing and her children were still with her, and sometimes you have to cry before you can keep going. Then she wiped her face and started looking for the kitchen to see if she could make herself useful. Grace Whitaker had never in her life waited for someone else to build her a home. She wasn't about to start now. The contract was 1 page long. Grace read it 3 times at the kitchen table that first night after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, and the only sound was the occasional pop of the fire and the distant call of something out in the dark hills. Ethan sat across from her with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, waiting without fidgeting, without pressing, without doing any of the things men usually did when they wanted a woman to hurry up and agree to something. She read it a 3rd time because she was looking for the catch. There was always a catch. There wasn't one. The document was plain and direct in a way that made her deeply suspicious, because in Grace's experience, plain and direct documents were rare, and documents offered freely by strangers were rarer still. It stated that she and her children were guests at Pine Ridge Ranch, under no legal obligation, that any labor she performed was voluntary and would be compensated at a fair rate to be agreed upon, that the $412 payment was a loan, not a purchase, with no repayment schedule and no interest, that she retained full parental authority over Emma, Samuel, and Lucy at all times, that she could leave whenever she chose for any reason with no debt called in and no legal consequence. She looked up at him. "Why is there a line about parental authority?" "Because I figured you'd want it in writing," Ethan said. "So there's no argument later." "You were expecting an argument later." "I was expecting you to want insurance." He picked up his coffee, finally drank once, set it back down. "Which is smart. You should want insurance." Grace looked at him across the table. "Mr. Callahan, what are you getting out of this? I told you, the ranch needs—" "I'm not talking about labor." She kept her voice level. "I'm talking about the rest of it. The room with a lock. The contract with no obligations. The way you talk to my children in the square." She paused. "Men don't do that without wanting something." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, once the way a man does when he's deciding how much truth to offer. "I had a family," he said. "Once? Or almost did." Another pause longer. "I lost them. Winter of '80. The storm that came down through the North Pass." He stopped there, and Grace understood from the stopping that the rest of it was something he'd packed away very carefully and was not yet ready to unpack in a stranger's presence. "I've been at this ranch alone for 8 years. And today I watched a woman stand on a platform and refuse to let anyone take her children from her for 40 minutes straight while a crowd laughed at her." He looked at her directly. "I didn't do it because I want something, Mrs. Whitaker. I did it because I still know right from wrong, and what was happening in that square today was wrong. That's all." Grace held his gaze for a long moment. She was not convinced. She was not sure she believed him entirely. But she believed that he believed it, and that was enough for tonight. She signed the contract. The first week was the hardest. Not because Ethan was difficult. He was frustratingly, almost entirely easy. He rose before dawn, worked through the day, came to dinner quiet and steady, and asked nothing of any of them that wasn't freely offered. He did not interfere with Grace's management of the children. He did not contradict her in front of them. He did not try to be anything other than what he'd presented himself as, a man offering space and waiting to see what would grow in it. The hard part was Emma. Emma had decided at some point during the last 11 weeks that the safest position was total distrust of every adult who wasn't her mother, and she was holding that position with the grim determination of an 8-year-old who has learned that the world can take things from you without warning and without apology. She watched Ethan the way a cat watches a dog. It has decided to tolerate, not with open hostility, but with a sustained, careful alertness that never quite switched off. At breakfast on the third morning, Ethan set a plate of biscuits in the center of the table, sat down, and said, "Emma, how do you take your coffee?" Emma stared at him. "I'm 8. I know. I'm asking about the future, when you're old enough. Just curious what kind of person you're going to be." Emma considered this with the gravity of a small judge. "I don't think I'll drink coffee. I think it smells bad." "Fair enough." Ethan took a biscuit. "What will you drink instead?" "Tea, the kind with honey." "I've got honey. Hector keeps bees out near the east pasture." Emma looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Grace. Then she looked back at her biscuit and said nothing, but the quality of her silence shifted slightly the way a door shifts when the latch releases, even if it hasn't swung open yet. Grace watched the whole exchange over her coffee cup and felt something complicated move through her chest. Samuel's adjustment was faster and louder and entirely predictable because Samuel was 6 years old and there was a horse. Cooper was a bay gelding of approximately 15 years who had, as advertised, strong opinions about everything. He tolerated Ethan. He regarded Hector with polite indifference. He had taken an immediate and baffling dislike to Pete, who maintained it was because he'd looked at Cooper wrong one time, and Cooper had never forgiven him. Cooper took one look at Samuel and walked directly to the fence where the boy was standing and pressed his nose against Samuel's chest. "He likes you," Ethan said, surprised in a way that seemed genuine. "Can I pet him?" "He's already decided you can. That's the whole conversation with Cooper." Samuel reached up and put both hands on the horse's nose and laughed with his whole body, and Grace, watching from 20 feet away, pressed one hand flat against her mouth and looked at the sky for a moment because she needed a second. She'd been watching for her son for 11 weeks. She'd been looking for the boy who used to chase chickens and argue with Emma about who got the bigger piece of cornbread and fall asleep in the middle of sentences when he stayed up past his bedtime. She'd been watching for him under the frightened, tight-faced child who'd stood on that platform with his jaw set and his fists clenched, and she'd been so afraid that boy was gone. He wasn't gone. He'd just been waiting for a horse to remind him he existed. It was Lucy who surprised everyone. Lucy was 2 years old, which meant she operated by a completely different logic than the rest of them, one that involved limited verbal negotiation and a great deal of direct action. She had decided somewhere between the wagon ride and the first morning at Pine Ridge that Ethan Callahan was hers in some fundamental way that required no explanation and admitted no argument. She followed him. That was all. She simply followed him. If Ethan walked across the kitchen, Lucy walked across the kitchen. If Ethan went out to the porch, Lucy went to the porch door and stood there making sounds until someone opened it. If Ethan sat down, Lucy appeared next to his chair and raised her arms with the imperious confidence of a small person who has never considered the possibility of being told no. On the 5th morning, Grace came out of her room to find Lucy sitting in Ethan's lap at the kitchen table while he read through what appeared to be ranch supply records, the baby leaning back against his chest with her thumb in her mouth and her eyes half closed, entirely peaceful. Ethan looked up when he heard Grace. Something in his face went careful and still, and he said very quietly, I was sitting here and she just climbed up. I wasn't sure." "It's all right," Grace said. Her voice came out softer than she intended. "She does what she wants. She always has." Ethan looked down at the baby in his lap and then back at his records, and something in the set of his shoulders told Grace that he was working very hard to treat this as a normal and unremarkable thing, and that it was not remotely normal or unremarkable to him, and that the effort of maintaining that composure was costing him something. She didn't push it. She went and made coffee and pretended she hadn't seen anything. But she had seen it. And she stored it away with the same careful deliberateness with which she stored everything she learned about Ethan Callahan. The first real trouble came on a Thursday. Grace was in the kitchen working through a basket of mending when Hector came to the back door, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who had bad news and was trying to figure out how to shape it into something less bad. "Mrs. Whitaker, someone came by while Mr. Callahan was out at the north fence." Grace set down the shirt she was mending. "Who?" "Man named Tate. Works for Harlan's outfit." Hector turned his hat in his hands once. "Left a message." "What kind of message?" Hector reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Grace took it and unfolded it and read it once and then sat very still. The message was not threatening in any language a court would recognize. It was polite in the way rattlesnakes are polite, technically not moving toward you, but coiled in a way that left no ambiguity about what would happen next. It said simply that Mr. Victor Harlan had become aware of certain matters pertaining to land records associated with the late Robert Whitaker's estate, and that he hoped Mrs. Whitaker would give him the courtesy of a meeting at her earliest convenience to discuss resolution. Resolution. That was the word it used. Resolution. Grace folded the paper back along its creases and looked at Hector. "What do you know about Victor Harlan?" Hector's jaw tightened slightly. That told her everything she needed before he said a word. "He runs cattle east of here, owns about 6,000 acres, maybe more that isn't on any map, sits on the county land commission." A pause. "He and Mr. Callahan have had disagreements about where Harlan's fence line sits." "What kind of disagreements?" "The kind where Harlan moves his fences 3 feet at a time and acts like nobody notices." Grace looked at the folded paper in her hand. "And my husband's land?" "I don't know for certain, ma'am, but there's a section of river property about 2 miles south of here that Mr. Callahan says was in dispute before he arrived. He never had the resources to fight it." Hector paused again, more deliberately this time. "If that land was originally Whitaker land, then my children would have a claim to it," Grace said. "Yes, ma'am. And Harlan would want that claim to disappear." Hector looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am. I reckon he would." Grace set the note on the table and went back to her mending, not because she'd stopped thinking about it, but because she'd learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury and precision was a skill, and what this situation required was precision. When Ethan came in from the north fence at supper time, she handed him the note without preamble. He read it. His face did not change in any dramatic way, but she watched the stillness in his jaw and the way his eyes moved through the words a second time slower. "You know what this is about," Grace said. It wasn't a question. "I have a good idea." He folded the note. "There's a parcel along the South River Bend, about 40 acres of good bottomland with reliable water. Your husband had it deeded before the county changed hands. Harlan's been claiming a title conflict on it for 4 years. He wants it." "Yes. And now that I'm here, my children have a claim." "Yes. And that makes us a problem." Ethan set the note on the table and looked at her. "Mrs. Whitaker, I want to be straight with you. Please, Harlan doesn't fight clean. He doesn't come at you directly. He uses the law, the county offices, the men he has in his pocket at the records clerk." Ethan's voice was measured and careful. "He can make things very difficult for a woman with 3 children and an uncertain legal standing. And he will if he thinks it's worth his time." Grace looked at him. "Is it worth his time?" 40 acres of river bottom with water rights. In this part of Wyoming." Ethan held her gaze. "Yes." Grace took a breath. She thought about the platform in Millhaven. She thought about the debt documents she'd never seen before. They arrived at her door, signed and sealed. She thought about the lawyer named Porter, who'd looked at the table and told her he couldn't prove forgery without access to county ledgers. She thought about county ledgers. "Mr. Callahan," she said slowly. "Those original land records, the ones from before the county changed hands, where would they be kept?" Ethan looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Courthouse archive, and the old church records office for anything that predates the county formal registry." "Would they still have original deeds?" "If nobody's destroyed them." A pause. "Or moved them." Grace nodded once very deliberately and said nothing more. She helped clear dinner. She got the children washed and into bed. She read Lucy a story and listened to Samuel tell her approximately everything he'd learned about Cooper that day, which was considerable. She sat on the edge of Emma's bed in the dark and waited while her daughter pretended to be asleep, and then said into the darkness, "Mom, are we in trouble again?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "There's a man who wants something that belongs to you and your brother and sister," she said finally. "And he's going to try to take it." Emma was quiet. Then, "Is he going to win?" Grace reached out and found her daughter's hand in the dark. "No," she said. "He is not going to win." "How do you know?" "Because he's never met us before," Grace said, "and we've already been through worse." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned her hand over and held Grace's properly fingers interlaced. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay." The way children agree to things when they've decided they believe you. Grace sat there for the while in the dark, holding her daughter's hand, and listening to the quiet house, and thought about county ledgers, and church record rooms, and the particular way that corrupt men always left a trail, because they were too certain of their own safety to clean up after themselves. She had helped Robert with records for 6 years of marriage. She knew how land documentation worked. She knew what forgery looked like when you knew where to look. Harlan thought he was dealing with a frightened widow who'd run out of options. He hadn't been paying attention. The following Sunday, Ethan drove the family into town for supplies. It was the first time Grace and the children had been back in Mill Haven since the auction, and Grace felt the stares before she saw them, the particular quality of attention a town gives to something it didn't expect to see upright and walking around. She held her head up. She kept her hand on Samuel's shoulder and let Emma walk beside her, and carried Lucy on her hip, and she did not look at anyone with apology in her eyes, because she had nothing to apologize for. At the dry goods store, Mrs. Calloway, a woman Grace had known slightly through church, touched her arm and said in a low voice, "I heard what happened, Grace. I want you to know that not everyone in this town thought it was right." "Thank you," Grace said carefully. "Some of us said so," Mrs. Calloway added, "afterward." Grace looked at her. "I appreciate that, Clara, truly." Afterward. The word settled in Grace's mind, and she turned it over as she collected flour and salt and the particular kind of thread Emma needed for the project she'd been working on since her second day at Pine Ridge, a small embroidered bookmark that she'd been making apparently for no one in particular and possibly for Ethan, though she hadn't said so, and Grace hadn't asked. On the way back to the wagon, Ethan stopped at the hardware store and came out 5 minutes later with a length of chain and a new padlock. He handed both to Grace without explanation. She looked at them. "For my door. Your lock's old," he said. "The new one's better." He turned to load the wagon. "I should have replaced it last week." Grace stood holding the padlock and looked at the back of his head and felt the complicated feeling again, the one she hadn't found a name for yet. Not trust. Not exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that was learning to breathe. Samuel came around the side of the wagon and tugged Ethan's sleeve. "Mr. Callahan." Ethan turned. "Someone at the feed store said something about my mom." Samuel's jaw was set in a way that made Grace's chest ache, because it was Robert's jaw and Robert's expression the particular stubbornness of the Whitaker men. "Said she was that auction woman. Said it like it was funny." Ethan looked at Samuel for a moment. "What did you say?" Ethan asked. "I didn't say anything. I didn't know if I was supposed to." Ethan crouched down in the same way he'd crouched in the town square 3 weeks ago, eye-level unhurried. You can always say something when someone disrespects your family. The question is what you choose to say. He paused. "You know what I would have said?" Samuel shook his head. "I would have said, my mother is the bravest person in this county, and if you've got something to say about her, I'd like to hear you say it louder." Ethan held the boy's gaze. "But that's just me." Samuel stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then he straightened up very slightly in the way children straighten when someone has handed them something that fits. "Okay," Samuel said. "I'll remember that." They drove home through the afternoon light with the children in the wagon bed, and the mountains spread out ahead of them, and the particular silence of people who are still learning what they are to each other. Grace sat in the front next to Ethan and watched the trail unwind ahead of them and turned the padlock over in her hands and thought about church record rooms and Riverland and a man named Harlan who had no idea what was coming for him. She thought about the note he'd sent. Resolution. She was going to give him resolution, just not the kind he was expecting. The ranch was quiet when they got back. Hector had left a note on the kitchen table. Short, 2 lines. Grace read it, and her hand went still. She read it again. Then she set it face down on the table and looked out the window for a moment because she needed to think clearly, and what was written on that note made thinking clearly very difficult. Someone had been on the south fence line, someone who wasn't any of Ethan's men, and they'd been watching the house. Ethan read Hector's note twice the same way Grace had, and then set it back on the table with the particular controlled stillness of a man deciding how alarmed to let himself be. "How long?" he asked when Hector came in from the barn. Pete spotted him around midday, maybe an hour before we left for town. He was gone by the time Pete got close enough to see anything useful. Hector turned his hat in his hands. Wasn't one of Harlan's regular hands. Pete didn't recognize him. "Which means Harlan hired outside," Ethan said. "That's what I figure." Grace stood at the kitchen counter with her arms crossed and her mind moving fast and precise. Outside help meant Harlan was escalating. Men who watched houses from fence lines weren't there to deliver polite notes about meetings. They were there to count heads, to learn routines, to report back on who came and went, and when the house went dark at night. "He's mapping us," she said. Both men looked at her. "He wants to know our patterns, when the children are outside, when the ranch hands are at the far pastures, when the house is empty." She looked at Ethan. "He's not going to come at us legally first. Not anymore. The note was to see how we'd react. Now he's moved to the next thing." Ethan studied her for a moment. "You've seen this before. My husband's cousins used the same approach before they showed up at my door with the debt papers. They watched us for 2 weeks first. I didn't know it at the time. I figured it out after." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not going to figure it out after this time." Ethan turned to Hector. "Double the watch on the south and east lines. Don't confront anyone, just observe and report. I want to know if the same man comes back or if there are others." Hector nodded and went out. Grace unfolded the note again and read it one more time. Not because she'd missed anything, but because she was looking at Hector's handwriting. At the particular detail he'd included, without being asked, the man had been watching the house, not the fence line, not the pasture, not the barn. The house specifically. The windows where the children's rooms were. She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket and said nothing about that last part because she didn't want to say it out loud yet. Not until she was certain, not until she'd thought through what it meant and what it required of her. That night, she checked the lock on her door twice. Then she checked the locks on the children's doors. Then she sat in the dark of her room and listened to the house breathe and made herself think clearly about Victor Harlan instead of about the formless dread that wanted to take up all the space in her chest. She needed those church records. She needed them before Harlan found a reason to make them unavailable. And she needed to understand exactly what her husband had owned and when and how it had allegedly been transferred, because if the transfer was forged, and she was increasingly certain it was, then the forgery would have fingerprints on it somewhere. Corrupt men were always careless about something. She fell asleep in the chair by the window with her boots still on. Which was how Emma found her in the morning and responded to with the particular combination of exasperation and tenderness that Grace was coming to understand was her daughter's primary mode of loving people. "Mom, you slept in the chair again." "I was thinking." "You were snoring." "I was thinking loudly." Emma handed her a cup of tea honey properly made in the way Hector had apparently shown her, and sat on the edge of the bed with her own cup and said, "Mr. Callahan got up at 4 this morning. I heard him go out." Grace looked at her over the tea. "You were awake at 4? "I heard something outside." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, the way her voice got when she was being careful about her words. "I looked out the window. It was just Mr. Callahan walking the fence line himself." Grace was quiet. He does that sometimes, Emma added. Hector told me. When something's worrying him, he walks the fence line at night instead of sleeping. Hector told you that. We talk. Emma took a sip of tea. He's teaching me some Spanish words, and I help him fix the chicken pen because his back hurts. A pause. He said Mr. Callahan walked the fence line every night for a year after he lost his family. Every single night. Grace set down her cup. Emma, I'm just telling you what Hector told me. Emma looked at her tea. I'm not saying anything else. But she was saying something else Grace knew in the particular sideways way that Emma said important things, never directly always at an angle, because direct statements could be argued with, but sideways ones had a way of landing and staying. Grace stood up and straightened her clothes and went to start breakfast, and did not think about a man walking a fence line alone in the dark for a year, because that was a thought that required more space than she had available this morning. 4 days later, she went to the church. She told Ethan she was going to return Mrs. Calloway's social call, and possibly pick up some thread from the dry goods store. She told Emma she was in charge until Grace got back, which Emma accepted with the quiet authority of a child who had been managing things since she was 6. She kissed Lucy and told Samuel to stay away from the back pasture, where Hector was repairing a section of fence with tools that were not toys. Ethan looked at her when she came to get the small wagon. He looked at her in the way that meant he knew she was going to do something he hadn't been informed about. Mrs. Calloway, he said, and the dry goods store. And Grace picked up the reins. And perhaps a brief stop at the old county records annex at St. Michael's Church if I happened to be passing. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the barn and came back with a shotgun, which he laid across the wagon seat beside her without comment. For Mrs. Calloway, Grace said. For the road, Ethan said. Come home before dark. She drove to town with the shotgun beside her and her mind running through everything she knew about land documentation in Wyoming Territory. The original county had been reorganized in 1882, which meant anything predating that reorganization was stored in the annex at St. Michael's property deeds, transfer records, original homestead filings. The county clerk's office held the post-1882 records, and the county clerk was a man named Briggs, who owed his position to Victor Harlan's political influence. Those records she couldn't trust. But St. Michael's was run by Father Donovan, who was 73 years old and famously indifferent to the opinions of wealthy cattle barons, having outlasted 3 of them already. Father Donovan met her at the church office door with the expression of a man who had been expecting someone to come looking eventually. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, I heard you'd come to the county. Come in. The annex records room was small and cool and smelled of old paper, which was a smell Grace associated with her father's study when she was a child, and which hit her now with an unexpected force of memory that she set aside firmly and filed for later. She told Father Donovan what she was looking for. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk, his eyes steady. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The original Whitaker homestead filing is here, he said. I know because a man came to look at it about 3 months ago, before your husband died. Grace went very still. What man? He didn't give a name. He gave a county authorization, which I later checked and found to be... Father Donovan paused delicately, irregularly issued. You let him look at the records. I let him look. I did not let him remove anything. And after he left, The old priest reached into his desk drawer and produced a folded document, made a copy of the original deed, and put it somewhere he wouldn't find it. Grace stared at the document in his hands. Father, she said carefully. Why? Because I have been watching Victor Harlan operate in this county for 11 years. Father Donovan said, and I have been waiting for someone with a reason to stop him. He held out the document. Your husband's original filing. 42 acres along the South River Bend, deeded 1879 with full water rights. Clear title, no encumbrances, signed by the original county commissioner before Harlan's man replaced him. Grace took the document with hands that were steadier than she felt. She read it. It was exactly what he'd described. Robert's name. The land. The water rights. 1879. "This is the original," she said. "That is a certified copy of the original. The original is in that cabinet behind you, exactly where it has always been." Father Donovan looked at her steadily. "The transfer document that Harlan's people claim supersedes it was filed in 1884. 5 years after your husband's original deed, and it carries your husband's signature. Robert never signed any transfer." "No," Father Donovan said. "I don't believe he did." The silence between them was the kind that comes when two people have arrived at the same place from different directions and are taking a moment to confirm they're seeing the same thing. "The signature's forged," Grace said. "I am not a document expert," Father Donovan said carefully. "I am only a priest who has seen Robert Whittaker's signature on the church registry for 6 years and noticed that the signature on the 1884 transfer document looks different in certain particulars." Grace looked at the copy in her hands and then back at the priest. "I need to take this. I made that copy for exactly that purpose." He paused. "There is also something else." She waited. Father Donovan reached back into the drawer and produced a second document, smaller, a folded piece of paper with a broken wax seal. "A woman named Mrs. Aldridge. She was the county commissioner's secretary before 1882. She left this with me 8 years ago. She said it was insurance. She died 4 years ago without ever needing to use it." He held it out. "I think perhaps it's time." Grace unfolded it. It was a letter. Handwritten, dated 1883, signed by Mrs. Aldridge herself. It described in plain, careful language being instructed by Victor Harlan personally to file a backdated transfer document for certain river properties, and being told that if she asked questions about the signatures, she would find herself without employment and her husband without his freight contract. It was a confession, written by a frightened woman who'd wanted something on record somewhere, who'd needed someone to know what had happened, even if she couldn't do anything about it herself. Grace sat in that cool, quiet room and held a dead woman's courage in her hands, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the complicated, unnamed feeling she'd been carrying since Pine Ridge, but something older and cleaner. The particular feeling of a woman who has been running in the dark and has just found solid ground beneath her feet. She folded both documents into her apron with hands that were now completely steady. She was almost at the wagon when she heard the horse behind her. She turned. The man who pulled up was not someone she knew, but she knew what he was. The particular posture of a hired man. The particular way his eyes moved over her and then past her to the saddlebag, where she'd just placed the documents. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said. Not a question. He knew who she was. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Harlan would like a word." "Mr. Harlan knows where to find me." She held the man's gaze without moving. "He can send a proper written request, and I'll give it due consideration." He was hoping for something more immediate. I'm sure he was. She reached the wagon, picked up the reins, and then picked up the shotgun and laid it across her lap in a way that was not threatening and was not subtle. "Tell Mr. Harlan I've had a productive morning, and I'm looking forward to discussing his concerns at the appropriate time and in the appropriate setting." She looked at the man steadily. "In front of witnesses." The man's jaw moved once. He looked at the shotgun. He looked at her face. He rode away without another word. Grace drove home with both hands on the reins and her heart going at twice its normal speed, and her face perfectly calm, because there were two things she knew for certain now. The first was that Harlan had someone watching the church, which meant he already knew or suspected she'd found something. The second was that she'd just told him by the way she'd responded that she wasn't frightened. That was true. She was not frightened. She was angry, which was a different thing entirely and considerably more useful. When she came through the gate at Pine Ridge, Ethan was at the corral, and he looked at her face and straightened up immediately. She handed him down the documents without preamble and watched him read them. She watched the careful stillness of his expression give way to something else as he understood what he was holding. He looked up at her. "Where did you get these?" "Father Donovan." "He's had these for 8 years for the letter." The deed copy he made 3 months ago, when Harlan's man came sniffing around. She watched him. The transfer Harlan filed is forged. Robert's signature was forged. This land belongs to my children. Ethan read the letter a second time slowly. His jaw was tight. Harlan knows you have this, he said. It wasn't a question. He had a man at the church. He'll know by tonight. Ethan looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them passed the unspoken understanding of two people who have just crossed a line they cannot uncross. We need a lawyer, Grace said. Not Porter. Harlan's got too much leverage on Porter. There's a man in Cheyenne, Ethan said slowly. Marcus Webb. He doesn't practice in this county, which means Harlan doesn't own him. He's handled land fraud cases before. A pause. He's expensive. I can cover it, Grace said. Ethan looked at her. I've been keeping back a portion of what you've been paying me, she said evenly. It's mine by the contract we signed. It's enough to retain him. For a moment, Ethan just looked at her with an expression she still didn't entirely have a name for. Then he nodded once slowly in the way of a man who is reassessing something he thought he understood. I'll send a wire tonight, he said. He was still holding the documents. He hadn't given them back. Grace reached out and took them from his hands and put them back in her apron and said, I'll keep these. Of course. I'm going to make copies tonight and put them in 3 separate places. Good. She turned toward the house and then stopped and turned back. Mr. Callahan. The man at the church, Harlan's man. He knew my name before I told him. He knew where I'd been, and he was waiting. Ethan's expression changed very slightly. He's been watching longer than we thought, Grace said. And he's not just watching the land. She paused. He's watching the children. The silence that fell was a different kind of silence from all the ones before it. Ethan said very quietly, How certain are you? Hector's note said the man on the south fence was watching the house, not the fence line, not the pastures, the windows where the children sleep. She held his gaze. I'm certain. Something moved through Ethan Callahan's face that she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled composure, not the careful steadiness, but something older and harder and far more dangerous. The particular expression of a man who has just decided that all previous calculations no longer apply. I'm not going to let anything happen to them, he said. And the way he said it was not a reassurance. It was a statement of intent plain and absolute as a deed filing. Grace looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. She went inside. She kissed Lucy, who was sitting in the kitchen with a wooden spoon and a pot lid, performing what appeared to be a very important private concert. She found Samuel at the fence with Cooper and told him dinner was in an hour. She found Emma at the kitchen table with her embroidery and sat down beside her and said nothing for a long moment. Emma looked up, looked at her mother's face, read it the way Emma always read faces, fast, thorough, and honest. How bad? Emma asked. We're going to be fine, Grace said. But things are going to move fast for a while. Emma nodded. She went back to her embroidery. 2 stitches then. Is Mr. Callahan going to help us? Grace thought about the expression on his face, the one she'd never seen before. Yes, she said. He is. 4 days later, Samuel disappeared. He was there at breakfast. He was there at morning chores feeding Cooper and arguing cheerfully with Pete about the correct way to brush a horse's tail, which was apparently a subject both of them had strong feelings about. He was there at mid-morning when Grace looked out the kitchen window and saw him at the fence. He was not there at noon. Grace noticed first. She came out to call him for lunch, and he wasn't at the fence. She checked the barn, not there. She checked the back pasture, not there. She checked the small stand of pines where he liked to sit and look at the mountains when he thought nobody was watching, not there. She walked back to the kitchen with her arms folded tight and her breathing very controlled, and said to Emma, who looked at her face and immediately went pale, Where is your brother? He said he was going to the fence, Emma said. That's the last I saw him. Grace was already moving. She was out the door and across the yard and calling for Hector before Emma had finished the sentence, and the sound of her voice must have carried something in it, because Hector came out of the south cabin at a run without being told twice. Ethan was in from the north pasture in 11 minutes. Grace counted. She stood in the yard and counted every minute, and kept her breathing steady and her hands still and her voice level when she told him. Because falling apart was not something she could afford, and she knew it, but the effort of not falling apart was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and the 11 weeks after Robert died were close competition. Ethan listened without interrupting. He looked at Hector. He looked at Pete. He looked at Grace. "South fence," he said to Hector. "Check for tracks, any sign of horses or a wagon." He turned to Pete. "North trail to the ridge, see if anyone's come through in the last 2 hours." He turned to Grace. "Stay here with the girls. Lock the doors." "I'm not staying here. Grace." He said her name for the first time, not Mrs. Whitaker, just Grace, and the way he said it stopped her. "Emma and Lucy need someone here. They need you here." He held her gaze. "I will find him. Do you understand me? I will find him." She looked at him. She looked at the absolute certainty in his face. Not the performance of certainty, but the real thing, the kind that comes from a decision already made. "Bring him home," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He was gone in 3 minutes. Hector and Pete split in 2 directions. Grace went back inside and locked the door and sat Emma down and told her plainly without softening it that Samuel was missing and that Ethan had gone to find him and that their job right now was to stay calm and stay together. Emma said nothing. She picked up Lucy and held her and said nothing at all, which was the most frightening response she could have given. They waited. Grace made tea she didn't drink. She checked the window every 4 minutes. She told herself all the things you tell yourself when you're waiting for something you're terrified of. He wandered. He got turned around. He's fine. He's fine. He's fine. But she knew with the particular knowing that lives in the body before the mind admits it, that Samuel had not wandered. Harlan had been watching the windows where her children slept. It was 3 hours before she heard a horse on the trail. She was at the window before the sound fully registered, and what she saw was Ethan's horse, and Ethan in the saddle, and in front of him, small hunched head down Samuel. Grace was out the door before she thought about it. She crossed the yard and Ethan pulled the horse up, and she reached up, and Samuel came down into her arms like something that had been held too long in the wrong shape, and she held him and said nothing, because there were no words for this. Nothing that would fit inside language, just the particular animal relief of a mother holding her child. Over his shoulder she looked at Ethan. His face was controlled but barely. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, the remnants of a fear that had passed through him and left marks. He dismounted and crouched down in front of Samuel, who was still pressed against Grace's side. "Samuel." His voice was very quiet. "Can you tell me what happened?" Samuel pulled back enough to look at him. His face was dirty, and there were tear tracks through the dirt, and his jaw was doing the Whitaker thing tight and set. But his eyes were young, very young, the way eyes go when something has stripped away all the careful composure a child builds. "2 men," Samuel said. "They had a wagon. They said—" He stopped, swallowed. "They said they had a message from the county about my mom." Ethan's jaw tightened once. He didn't look away from Samuel. "They took me to a line cabin, east side near the creek." Samuel's voice was very flat in the way of children reporting things that frightened them past the point of showing the fright. "They said if my mom gave up the land documents, they'd let me go. They said if she didn't—" He stopped again. "It's all right," Ethan said. "You don't have to finish that part." Samuel looked at him for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "If they take Mom away, will you still be my dad?" The question fell into the silence of the yard and stayed there. Ethan looked at the boy for one long moment. Then he reached out and put one hand on Samuel's shoulder, careful, steady, the way you touch something you're afraid of breaking, and said without hesitation, without qualification, without the slight pause that men give themselves when they're deciding how much to mean something, "Nobody is taking any of you from me." Samuel held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then something in him broke open in the good way, the way that releases rather than destroys. And he leaned into Ethan's side, and Ethan's arm came around him and held on. Grace stood above them both and pressed her hand flat against her mouth and looked at the mountains and breathed. Then Samuel pulled back and looked up at Ethan and said in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady and mostly succeeding, "Okay." Just that. And then, "Okay, Dad." Ethan sent the wire to Marcus Webb in Cheyenne that same night. He came back from the telegraph office in town with his jaw set and his eyes carrying something Grace had learned to read as controlled fury. Not the loud kind, not the kind that throws things and shouts, but the quiet kind that makes decisions and follows through on them without flinching. He sat down at the kitchen table and told Grace what the deputy had said when Ethan reported Samuel's kidnapping. He said he'd look into it, Ethan said. Grace looked at him. "That's all." He said there was no proof the men were connected to Harlan. He said boys wander sometimes. Ethan's voice was completely flat. He said Samuel was home safe, and maybe we ought to let the matter rest. Grace sat with that for a moment. The deputy who had stood in that square and watched a woman and her children offered up like livestock was now suggesting that the kidnapping of a 6-year-old boy ought to be let rest. She was not surprised. She was not even particularly shocked. She was simply adding it to the ledger she'd been keeping since the morning Deputy Crane arrived at her door, the ledger of every person in this county who had chosen Harlan's comfort over other people's safety. That ledger was getting long. "Webb will come," Ethan said. "I offered his full rate plus expenses. He wired back inside the hour." "When?" "4 days." He looked at her. "We need to keep those documents safe until then." Grace had already moved the documents twice since coming home from the church. The copies were in 3 separate locations. One sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, one given to Father Donovan to keep in the church safe, one folded inside an envelope addressed to Marcus Webb's Cheyenne office that Ethan had carried to the post that morning. The originals, Father Donovan's certified copy, and Mrs. Aldridge's letter were in Grace's possession, and she was keeping them on her person. "They're safe," she said. Ethan nodded. He trusted her judgment on this, she'd noticed. He didn't double-check or suggest alternatives or imply she might have missed something. He simply trusted her, and the simplicity of that continued to surprise her in small ways every time she noticed it. Samuel was quieter than usual for 2 days after. He stayed close to the house, close to Cooper's fence, close to wherever Ethan happened to be working. He didn't talk much about what had happened, and Grace didn't push him because she knew from experience that children process fear on their own timeline. And the worst thing you can do is stand at the edge of it and ask if they're ready yet. On the second evening, Samuel found Ethan in the barn doing the last check on the horses and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Ethan looked up. "Hey." "Hey." Samuel came in and stood beside Cooper's stall. Cooper immediately applied his nose to the boy's ear, which was Cooper's version of a greeting. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Those men who took me." Samuel kept his eyes on Cooper. "Were they scared of you when you came?" Ethan considered this honestly. "I think they were surprised," he said. "I don't know if scared is the right word." "Were you scared when you were looking for me?" A pause. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I was." Samuel looked at him. "You didn't look scared." "Sometimes you can't afford to look how you feel." Ethan moved to the next stall, continued his check. "Doesn't mean it isn't there." Samuel was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "When I was in that cabin, I kept thinking I had to be brave, because that's what you do. Is that stupid?" Ethan stopped what he was doing and looked at the boy directly. "Samuel, that is the least stupid thing I've ever heard." Samuel's jaw did the Whitaker thing, tight and controlled, and his eyes went bright for just a moment before he got them back under control. He nodded once very quickly. "Okay," he said. "Okay, good." He stayed in the barn another hour, brushing Cooper with the focused deliberateness of someone working through something difficult by keeping his hands busy, and Ethan worked beside him in silence, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Grace watched them from the barn door for a few minutes unnoticed, and then went back to the house. Marcus Webb arrived on a Wednesday 3.5 days after Ethan's wire, which told Grace he'd left Cheyenne almost immediately. He was a compact, precise man of 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular manner of a lawyer who had spent decades in courtrooms and had learned that economy of language was its own form of power. He read every document Grace laid on the table without commenting, without reacting, without doing anything except reading. When he was done, he arranged them in a careful stack, aligned the edges, and looked up. "This is enough," he said. Grace felt something in her chest release. "The forged signature alone is actionable," Webb continued. "Combined with Mrs. Aldridge's letter, which constitutes a direct witness account of Harlan's instruction to file the fraudulent transfer, and the original 1879 deed which predates the fraudulent transfer by 5 years." He paused. "This is enough to bring before a county hearing and have the fraudulent transfer overturned." "Harlan controls the county commissioner," Ethan said. "He controls the current county commissioner," Webb said. "He does not control a formal land hearing, which by territorial law requires a 3-member panel, including a representative from the territorial governor's office." He looked at Ethan over his glasses. "The current territorial governor is not on friendly terms with Harlan. I know because I have done work for the governor's office." The silence at the table shifted quality. "You came prepared," Grace said. "I came because I've been waiting for a clean case against Harlan for 6 years. Webb said simply. "You've handed me one." He looked at the documents again. "I'll file for the hearing within the week. Harlan will be notified, which means he'll know immediately that you have these documents and that they're already in legal process." "Which means he'll try something before the hearing," Ethan said. "Yes." Webb was matter-of-fact about it. "He will try to discredit the documents, discredit Mrs. Whitaker, or find a way to make the case go away before it can be heard." He looked at Grace. "I need you to be prepared for that." "What kind of discrediting?" Grace asked. "Rumors about your character. Questions about the legitimacy of your arrangement here." Webb glanced briefly at Ethan and back. "Possibly an attempt to have the children removed to county custody on some fabricated welfare concern, which would give him leverage." Grace's hands went flat on the table. "He cannot take my children. Not while your legal standing is clear and your living situation is documented as stable." Webb looked at her steadily. "Which is why I am going to suggest, and you are entirely free to decline, that we formalize your arrangement here before the hearing." A silence. "Formalize," Grace said. "A legal record of stable household, stable income, stable family structure." Webb's voice was carefully neutral. "It removes the leverage." Grace looked at the table. She looked at Ethan, who was looking at Webb with an expression she couldn't read. "We'll discuss it," Ethan said quietly. Webb nodded and moved on, and Grace kept her eyes on the documents and felt the particular complicated weight of a decision that hadn't been asked yet, but was already in the room. Webb filed the papers on Friday. By Saturday morning, the town knew. Grace could tell because Mrs. Calloway appeared at the gate before breakfast with a basket of bread and the expression of a woman who has decided to pick a side and is arriving to declare it. She handed Grace the basket and said, "I want you to know that Reverend Marsh preached last Sunday about bearing false witness, and half the congregation knew he meant Harlan's people and said so after the service." Grace took the basket. "Thank you, Clara." "There are others," Mrs. Calloway said. "People who've been watching Harlan operate for years and never had a reason to say anything, because there was nothing to say it toward." She looked at Grace directly. "There is now." By Monday, 2 other families had sent word to Webb that they had information relevant to Harlan's land practices. By Tuesday, a former county records clerk named Abrams, a man who had quit his position 3 years ago and moved to a farm outside of town, had appeared at Webb's temporary office with a handwritten account of being told to alter documentation on 4 separate property transfers. The case was growing. Grace watched it grow with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for the current to shift and is not going to miss it now that it has. She was in the kitchen on Tuesday evening when Emma came in from the pantry where she'd been organizing the dry goods, a task she'd taken on voluntarily 2 weeks ago, and performed with a systematic thoroughness that made Grace think, not for the first time, that her daughter had the mind of someone who should be running something significant, and set a ledger on the table. Grace looked at it. "Where did that come from?" "The storage room at St. Michael's." Emma's voice was carefully matter-of-fact. "Father Donovan let me help sort the record boxes last week. He said some of them hadn't been opened since before the county reorganization." Grace looked at her daughter. "I found it in the third box," Emma said, "under some old census papers." She opened it to a page she'd marked with a strip of cloth. "I think these are financial records. I think some of these numbers match the property transfer dates." Grace sat down and pulled the ledger toward her and began to read. It took her 20 minutes to understand what she was looking at. When she understood it, she sat very still for a moment, and then looked up at Emma, who was watching her with 8-year-old eyes that had figured out something significant, and was waiting to find out if she was right. "Go get Mr. Callahan," Grace said. Emma went. The ledger was a record of payments. Not labeled as such, the entries used abbreviated codes and initials, but Grace had spent 6 years helping Robert with his business records, and she knew how men hid money flows inside legitimate-looking documentation. The dates corresponded precisely to the fraudulent property transfers. The initials corresponded with no great stretch of interpretation to county officials Grace could name, and the amounts were substantial, not enormous, but consistent, the kind of regular, reliable payments that kept men cooperative over years. It was a bribery ledger. Harlan had been keeping a bribery ledger. Ethan came in from outside and read it in the same focused silence Grace had used. When he looked up, his expression was the one she'd started to think of as his decision. Face the one that meant he'd assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion and was not going to be moved from it. "Webb needs to see this tonight," he said. "Yes. I'll ride to his office. Take Hector." Ethan looked at her. "Take Hector," she said again. "Don't go alone. Not tonight." He held her gaze for a moment, and she watched him weigh his instinct, which was clearly to go alone and fast, against her reasoning, which was sound, and he knew it. "All right," he said. "Hector." After he left, Grace sat at the table with Emma beside her and the ledger between them and said, "Emma, how did you know to look at the numbers?" Emma considered the question. "The dates on the property transfers you showed Mr. Webb. I heard you and him talking about them. And when I was sorting the boxes, I noticed this ledger had the same date range on the spine." She paused. "I thought it might be connected." Grace looked at her daughter. At the precise, methodical 8-year-old mind that had walked into a church storage room and come out with the piece of evidence that turned a strong case into an undeniable one. "Emma Ruth Whitaker," Grace said. "Yes, ma'am." "You are remarkable." Emma looked at the table with the particular expression of someone who is deeply pleased and is pretending not to be. "I just sorted boxes." "You did a great deal more than sort boxes, and you know it." Emma's mouth moved, almost a smile. "Father Donovan gave me tea," she said, "the kind with honey." Grace put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and pulled her close, and Emma let her, which was its own kind of victory, because Emma had not let anyone pull her close easily since Robert died. Webb's reaction to the ledger was, for a man of his controlled precision, almost enthusiastic. He used the word extraordinary twice, which Grace suspected was for Marcus Webb, the equivalent of another man turning a cartwheel. He filed a supplementary brief the following morning. The hearing was set for the end of the week. Harlan's response came Thursday afternoon, and it came the way Grace had expected, not directly, not cleanly, but sideways and institutional, and dressed up in the language of concern. 2 men arrived at Pine Ridge with a document from the county welfare office stating that an anonymous complaint had been filed regarding the living conditions of 3 minor children residing at the property, and that a formal review of household circumstances was required before the scheduled land hearing. Grace read the document at the door. She read it twice. She looked at the 2 men, both of them visibly uncomfortable. both of them wearing the expression of people doing a job they know is dirty. And she said very calmly, "Wait here." She went inside. She went to her room and got the copy of the contract she'd signed with Ethan, the contract that Webb had formally notarized 2 days ago as part of establishing her legal standing. She got the letter Webb had drafted documenting the stable household, the children's school progress under Emma's tutoring system. Samuel's documented regular care at Pine Ridge, Lucy's health records from the doctor in town. She got the signed statement from Hector and Pete attesting to the family's circumstances. She got the letter from Mrs. Calloway and 4 other women from town speaking to Grace's character and the children's well-being. She went back to the door and handed all of it to the first man. He looked at the stack in his hands, then at her. "My children are healthy, safe, educated, and loved," Grace said. "Every claim in that anonymous complaint is false, and the documentation I've just given you will demonstrate that to anyone who reviews it honestly." She held the man's gaze. "If this review proceeds anyway, I will be at that welfare office tomorrow morning with my attorney, and I will request that the source of the anonymous complaint be identified and placed in the public record." A pause. "Does Harlan pay you enough to have your name in that record?" The man's jaw moved. "I didn't think so," Grace said. She closed the door. She stood on the other side of it with her back against the wood, and her eyes closed and counted to 10 very slowly, because she had just bluffed. Webb hadn't actually confirmed they could force the complainant's name into public record, and she wasn't entirely certain of the procedure, but she had said it with complete certainty, and she was reasonably sure the men on the other side of that door were not lawyers. She heard them leave. She opened her eyes. Samuel was standing in the hallway, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, somewhere between impressed and a little frightened, the way people look when they realize the person they thought they knew is more than they understood. "Mom," he said. "Yes. You're kind of scary." Grace straightened up from the door. "Good," she said. "Go wash up for dinner." The night before the hearing, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in her room with the solid dark around her and listened to the house and thought about everything that could go wrong tomorrow. The panel could be compromised. Webb could have misjudged the governor's office support. The ledger's entries could be ruled inadmissible. Harlan could arrive with something she hadn't anticipated, some document or witness or legal maneuver that she hadn't seen coming. She was still running through it when she heard the quiet sound of boots on the porch boards. She got up and went to the window. Ethan was sitting on the porch steps in the dark, the way she'd heard he used to walk the fence line, not restless, not pacing, just sitting with the weight of something and letting it settle. A cup of coffee in his hands, going cold. Grace put on her shawl and went to the front door and opened it. He looked up. She sat down beside him on the steps. Not close. Just beside. For a while neither of them said anything, and the night was big and quiet around them, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. And Grace thought about how strange it was that she could sit in silence beside a man she'd known for 2 months and feel more steady than she'd felt in years. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" she asked. "About the hearing, no." He turned the cup in his hands. "Webb knows what he's doing." "Then what?" A long pause. "After tomorrow," Ethan said, "when the land is yours and the case is closed and Webb goes back to Cheyenne, what happens then?" Grace was quiet. "You'll have options," he said. "Land of your own. Legal standing. A reputation in this county that nobody's going to challenge again." He looked at the dark mountains. "You won't need Pine Ridge anymore." Grace looked at the side of his face, at the carefully controlled expression that was working harder than usual. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Ethan." She paused. Then, Ethan. It was the first time she'd said it. She felt him go slightly still. "Do you want us to stay?" He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she heard everything he was deciding in the silence, all the things a man decides when he's been alone for 8 years and has very carefully not allowed himself to want things and is now being asked directly. "Yes," he said, simply, without decoration. Yes, I do. Grace looked at the mountains. She thought about Emma with her tea and her embroidery and Hector's Spanish words. She thought about Samuel and Cooper and the word he'd used in the yard. She thought about Lucy, who had made her choice about Ethan Callahan on approximately day 2 and had not revised it once. She thought about what family meant, not the kind you were handed, not the kind that arrived with obligation and expectation built in, but the kind you chose carefully and deliberately, one day at a time, because the people in it had shown you who they were, and you had decided that was someone worth building something beside. Then we'll stay, she said. Ethan was quiet for another moment. Then he let out a breath that she understood had been held for longer than tonight. All right, he said quietly. All right. They sat on the steps until the coffee was completely cold, and the stars had moved, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed saying. And in the morning, they would go to the courthouse and finish what Harlan had started, and they would finish it together. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear, and Grace was dressed before the sun was fully up. She heard the children moving Samuel up early the way he always was. Now boots on the porch boards, the particular sound of a boy who had somewhere to be, and was ready for it. Emma in the kitchen, quiet and deliberate, setting the table without being asked. Lucy, who had no understanding of what today meant, but had absorbed something from the atmosphere of the house, and was being unusually cooperative, sitting still, while Emma braided her hair and saying only once that it was too tight. Ethan was already outside. Grace stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her children for a moment, just long enough to feel the full weight of what she was carrying into that courthouse today. Not just the documents, not just the evidence, but these 3 people who had stood on a wooden platform in the summer heat and held on to each other while a crowd laughed, and who had come through 11 weeks of grief and fear and displacement, and arrived somehow here at a kitchen table in the Wyoming mountains, whole and fed and home. She was not going to lose this. She turned and went outside to find Ethan. He was at the wagon checking the harness with the focused attention he gave to anything he needed to be certain about. He looked up when he heard her. He took in her expression, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes, and nodded once slowly in the way that had become their particular language for things that didn't need words. "Webb's meeting us at the courthouse at 9, he said. "I know. Harlan will have lawyers, more than one." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Ethan, are you ready?" He held her gaze. "Been ready since the night I read that ledger." They drove to Millhaven with the children in the wagon bed and the morning light coming sideways through the pines, and Grace sat in the front with the document case on her lap and her hands steady and thought about nothing except what she needed to say and when she needed to say it. Samuel sat with his back straight the entire drive. Emma held Lucy and kept her face forward. Nobody spoke much, but the silence was the good kind. Not frightened, not uncertain, but the silence of people who have decided something and are moving toward it. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Grace had not expected that. She'd expected the panel, the lawyers, the officials, the particular small audience of interested parties that attended land hearings in county seats. She had not expected what appeared to be most of Millhaven standing outside the courthouse steps, and a fair number inside the lobby, talking in low voices that went quieter when she walked through the door. Mrs. Calloway was there. Abrams, the former records clerk, was there with his wife. Father Donovan had come down from St. Michael's and stood near the back wall with his hands folded and his expression composed. 2 of the women who had signed statements about Grace's character were there, and 3 families Grace recognized as people whose property bordered Harlan's contested land, and a cluster of ranch hands and townspeople she didn't know by name, but whose presence meant something she was still trying to understand. Webb met her at the door. He looked at the crowd and then at Grace with something that was almost satisfaction. "Word got out," he said simply. "How much word?" "Enough. The governor's representative arrived last night. He's reviewed the primary documents." Webb adjusted his glasses. He was not pleased with what he found. Grace absorbed that. "And Harlan? He's inside with 3 lawyers from Cheyenne. He arrived 2 hours ago." Webb paused. He also filed a counter motion this morning claiming the ledger is fabricated. Grace felt the familiar cold anger settle in her chest, like river stone, clean and heavy, and clarifying. Can he make that stick? Not with Abrams's testimony, he can't. Abrams's handwriting is in that ledger, his initials. He's prepared to explain every entry. Webb looked at her steadily. He's scared Mrs. Whitaker, but he's going to do it. He's braver than he thinks he is, Grace said. Most people are, Webb said. Shall we go in? The hearing room held perhaps 40 people and was holding 60. The three-member panel sat at the front 2 county officials. Grace didn't know well, and in the center a sharp-faced woman of perhaps 50 named Commissioner Aldis, who represented the governor's office, and who had the expression of someone who had read every page of every document and had arrived at this hearing with conclusions already formed and was prepared to defend them. Harlan sat at the right table with his 3 lawyers arranged around him like a wall. He was a large, florid man of 60 who wore his wealth in the particular way of men who want it. Notice the expensive coat, the silver watch chain, the deliberate posture of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He looked at Grace when she sat down. She looked back at him without expression, without apology, without the slightest indication that she found his presence remarkable. He looked away first. Webb made the opening statement in the precise, unhurried manner of a man who knows the ground under him is solid. He laid out the timeline, the original 1879 deed, the fraudulent 1884 transfer, the forged signature, Mrs. Aldridge's letter, the bribery ledger, Abrams's corroboration. He did it without drama, without embellishment, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own, and he knew it. Harlan's lead attorney, a man named Fitch, who had the air of someone who had won cases through volume and confidence, rather than substance, objected 4 times in the first 10 minutes. Commissioner Aldis overruled him 4 times with the same even tone, each time the tone of a woman who has heard better objections and is not going to pretend otherwise. Then Abrams took the stand. He was a slight, nervous man of 45 who sat with his hands clasped tight in his lap and his eyes moving between Webb and the panel and the floor. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for 3 years and was now being asked to set it down in front of 60 people. Webb walked him through the ledger entries slowly. Abrams confirmed each one, the dates, the amounts, the initials, the property transfers they corresponded to. His voice shook slightly at first, and then steadied the way. Voices steady when people realize the thing they were most afraid of is already happening, and they're still standing. Fitch's cross-examination was aggressive and loud, and accomplished nothing. Abrams held his ground. Every question Fitch asked about the ledger's authenticity, Abrams answered with the specificity of a man who had made those entries himself and remembered every one. When Abrams stepped down, the room was different. Something had shifted in the quality of the attention, not just the panel's attention, but the attention of every person standing along the walls. The townspeople, the ranch families, the people who had been watching Harlan operate for years and had never had a place to put what they knew. They had a place now. Grace testified next. She had prepared for this with Webb for 2 evenings, going through every question he anticipated Fitch would ask, every angle Harlan's lawyers might use to discredit her. She had prepared for the questions about the auction, about Pine Ridge, about her arrangement with Ethan. She had prepared for the implication that she was an unreliable witness, a woman of uncertain standing, a person who had arrived in this county under difficult circumstances and might be motivated by something other than the truth. What she had not entirely prepared for was the absolute silence of the room when she began to speak. She told the truth. She told it plainly and in order, and without the emotional wavering that Fitch was clearly expecting, because Grace Whitaker had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing a woman in a room full of skeptics can do is refuse to perform distress for them. She described the debt notice, the lawyer Porter and what he'd found, the auction, the documents she'd recovered from Father Donovan, the man at the church who had been sent to intercept her, Samuel's kidnapping, and she did not soften this. She said exactly what had happened, exactly what Samuel had been told, and she watched 3 members of the panel and approximately half the room go very still as she said it. When she finished, the room was quiet. Fitch stood up. He looked at his notes. He looked at Commissioner Aldous. He looked at the room, at the faces of 60 people watching him, and Grace saw him make the calculation. The lawyer's calculation about when a cross-examination helps your case and when it makes things worse. He sat back down. Commissioner Aldous looked at Harlan's table with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was not working very hard to be anything else. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "I have some questions." What followed was not comfortable for Victor Harlan. Commissioner Aldous was not aggressive. She was worse than aggressive. She was precise, and she asked her questions with the patience of a woman who already knew the answers and was giving him the opportunity to either tell the truth or demonstrate publicly that he wouldn't. She asked about the 1884 transfer, about the signature, about the payments recorded in the ledger, about the anonymous welfare complaint filed the day before the hearing. Harlan's answers were long and elaborate and explained very little. When he referenced Mrs. Aldridge's letter as a forgery, Commissioner Aldous set down her pen and said, "Mr. Harlan, Mrs. Aldridge was a county employee for 11 years with no record of dishonesty and no documented grievance against you. She sealed this letter 8 years ago and left it with a priest. What possible motivation would she have had to forge a document she never attempted to use?" Harlan's lawyer started to respond. Commissioner Aldous looked at him. He stopped. Harlan said after a pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer, "I cannot speak to the woman's motivations." "No," Commissioner Aldous said. "I don't suppose you can." The panel deliberated for 40 minutes. Grace sat in the hallway outside the hearing room with Ethan on one side, and Emma on her other side, and Samuel on the bench across from them, and Lucy walked back and forth along the length of the hallway, because Lucy did not sit still for 40 minutes under any circumstances. Hector stood near the door with Pete, both of them quiet. Both of them there because they'd asked to come, and Ethan had said yes without hesitation. Nobody talked much. Ethan's hand rested on the bench between them, not quite touching Grace's. Emma had her embroidery out the bookmark that had been finished for a week, but that she kept adding small stitches to, Grace suspected, because it gave her hands something to do, and worked at it with her head bent. Mrs. Calloway appeared with coffee, and distributed it without being asked, which Grace accepted with genuine gratitude, because she hadn't eaten since 5 that morning, and the coffee was the only thing between her and the particular hollow shaking that came from too much adrenaline and too little food. "You did well in there," Mrs. Calloway said quietly. "The truth did well in there," Grace said. "Same thing in your case." Grace looked at her. Then she looked at the courthouse hallway, at the people standing along the walls, the families who had come for their own reasons and stayed, the townspeople who had watched a woman be auctioned off 2 months ago, and some of whom had laughed, and some of whom had been silent, and some of whom had gone home and thought about it afterward and decided that silence was its own kind of participation. She looked at all of them and thought about what it took for people to change their minds, how much easier it was to go along with power than to stand against it, how much courage it required to be an Abrams, a frightened ordinary person who did the right thing anyway. The door opened. Webb came out and looked at Grace and said, "The panel has a decision." The room was standing room only when they returned. Commissioner Aldous read the decision in the same measured, unhurried tone she'd used for everything else, and Grace stood and listened and kept her hands still. The fraudulent 1884 transfer was voided. The original 1879 deed was confirmed as valid. The 42 acres along the South River Bend with full water rights were restored to the estate of Robert Whitaker, held in trust for his children, Emma Samuel and Lucy Whitaker, until each reached the age of majority. Victor Harlan was referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office for investigation of land fraud, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy. A referral that Commissioner Aldous described as, in her assessment, well supported by the evidence presented. The room erupted. Not politely, not quietly. It erupted in the way that people erupt when something they've been waiting for finally happens, when a weight they've been carrying collectively finally lifts. There was noise and movement, and Mrs. Calloway was crying, and Abrams sat in his chair with his face in his hands, not from grief, but from the particular release of a man who has done the thing he was afraid to do and survived it. Grace stood very still in the middle of all of it. She felt Emma's hand take hers. She felt Samuel press against her side. She felt Lucy, who Hector had been holding, reach for her, and she took her baby and held her and looked at the ceiling for a moment and let herself feel it, all of it, the whole weight of it, the grief and the fear, and the months of holding things together with both hands, and the particular triumph of a woman who had been told at every turn that she had no options and had refused to believe it. She felt a hand on her shoulder, light and certain. She looked up at Ethan, who was looking at her with the expression she'd never had a name for until this moment. The one she now understood was simply the face a person makes when they are looking at something they love and are not trying to hide it anymore. She reached up and put her hand over his. Harlan left the courthouse with his lawyers in a tight cluster and got into his carriage without looking at anyone. He did not look at Grace. He did not acknowledge the crowd. He left, and the absence of the particular weight of his influence in that county was something Grace expected people would be feeling for a long time slowly, the way you notice the absence of a headache you'd had so long you'd forgotten it wasn't normal. It was Samuel who surprised her in the end. Outside on the courthouse steps, with the town milling around them, and Webb accepting congratulations, and Father Donovan talking to Commissioner Aldous, and Lucy systematically dismantling Hector's hat, Samuel tugged Ethan's sleeve. Ethan looked down. "I want to tell you something," Samuel said. "All right." Samuel squared his shoulders. "When those men had me in the cabin, I wasn't just thinking about being brave like you. I was thinking—" He stopped, reordered himself the way 6-year-olds do when they're trying to say something exactly right. "I was thinking that if you could come find me, I wanted to be worth finding. I wanted to be the kind of person you'd want to come back for." Ethan went very still. "And you came," Samuel said. "So I reckon I was right." Ethan crouched down and looked at the boy for a long moment, and the courthouse steps and the crowd and the whole noisy afternoon went distant and quiet around them. "Samuel," he said, "you are worth every mile of that ride, and every mile after it, and every mile that's ever going to come." He held the boy's gaze. "You have never not been worth it. You understand me?" Samuel nodded. His jaw did the Whitaker thing just for a second. Then he straightened up and said with the particular dignity of a boy who has decided to be a man about something, "Okay, good." And then very quietly, "Thanks, Dad." Emma, who had been pretending not to listen from approximately 3 feet away, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and turned to look at the street with fierce concentration, blinking hard. Grace watched her daughter and felt her own eyes sting, and decided that today was a day when that was acceptable. The drive home was different from the drive in. Louder for one thing, Samuel kept recounting parts of the hearing with the animated inaccuracy of someone who is going to tell this story for years. And Lucy provided commentary in her own language, and even Emma offered corrections to Samuel's account with the precision of a girl who had been paying close attention. Ethan drove and said nothing, but was smiling in the private way he had, slight and real, and not performed for anyone. Grace sat beside him and watched the mountains and felt the complicated, unnamed feeling in her chest finally clarify into something she could recognize. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just relief. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere you hadn't known you were heading and finding it was exactly where you needed to be. 3 months later, Ethan proposed. He did it badly, which Grace would tell him later, and which he would agree with entirely. He did it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning while she was mending, and he was pretending to read ranch accounts, and he said without preamble or setup or any of the romantic architecture that the moment probably deserved, "Grace, I want to marry you, if you'll have me." She put down the mending. She looked at him. "That's it," she said. "That's the proposal." He looked slightly pained. "I had a better version. I lost it somewhere between the barn and the kitchen." "What was the better version?" "It involved—" He paused. "More words. And possibly the porch. And I was going to wait until the evening. But I've been carrying it around for 3 weeks, and I couldn't wait anymore." He looked at her directly, the way he always did. No deflection, no performance. Just the plain, honest weight of what he meant. I want to be your husband. I want to be their father. Not because you need it, or because it protects anything legally, or because it makes practical sense, though it does. But because somewhere between the day I handed you down from that platform and tonight, I stopped being able to imagine this house without all four of you in it, and I don't want to imagine it. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. Yes? Yes. She picked up the mending again. You can do the porch version later if it makes you feel better. The corner of his mouth moved. It might. I'll act surprised. They were married 6 weeks later, beneath a sky so blue it looked painted in the yard at Pine Ridge, with Father Donovan presiding, and every person in Millhaven who had ever been on the right side of anything standing in attendance. Mrs. Calloway cried through the entire ceremony. Hector and Pete wore their best shirts, which they had clearly pressed with great effort and strong opinions about creases. Abrams came with his wife and stood near the back and looked like a man who had learned that doing the right thing had more good consequences than he'd expected. Emma walked Grace down the makeshift aisle between the guests with the gravity of someone who understands what a moment means and intends to do it properly. She did not cry. She held her chin up the way Grace had always told her to, and she walked her mother forward, and she placed Grace's hand in Ethan's with the particular deliberateness of a child who has decided fully, and without reservation, to trust someone. Samuel stood beside Ethan. He stood there like it was the most natural place in the world, which it was, which it had been for a long time now. Lucy threw flower petals for approximately 30 seconds, and then sat down in the middle of the aisle and began examining one of the petals with intense scientific interest, and the entire gathering laughed, and Grace laughed too. And Ethan was still smiling when Father Donovan pronounced them married. When the ceremony was over, Ethan knelt down in front of the children. He looked at Emma first, then Samuel. Then Lucy, who abandoned the flower petal and applied both hands to his face and examined it thoroughly, which he tolerated with complete patience. I made a promise on a platform in Millhaven, he said. Told a woman I'd be a husband and a father. I intend to keep that promise for the rest of my life. He looked at each of them in turn, Emma's precise, serious eyes, Samuel's bright ones, Lucy's wide and dark and entirely certain. Every single day, as long as I'm breathing. Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had never done in the presence of anyone except her mother. She leaned forward and hugged him. It lasted 3 seconds. She pulled back and straightened up and looked at the middle distance as if nothing had happened. But her jaw was soft, and her eyes were full, and Ethan for just a moment pressed his hand briefly over his own chest, as if checking that something was still there. Samuel grabbed his arm. Lucy climbed onto his back. Grace watched and let herself feel all of it without flinching away from any of it. The joy and the grief underneath it, the missing of Robert that would always be there. The gratitude for what had been built from the wreckage of what was lost. The extraordinary, ordinary fact of her children being happy. The years that followed were good years. Not easy. Nothing in Wyoming. Territory was easy, and the ranch had hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary difficulties of people learning to build something together but good. Webb's referral resulted in Harlan's prosecution and the unraveling of his land holdings, which freed families across the county from arrangements they'd never had the power to challenge. 3 of those families sent Grace letters. One of them named a daughter after her, which Grace learned about 2 years later and kept very quiet about because it undid her completely. Emma grew into exactly the teacher Grace had suspected she would be. Systematic, demanding deeply fair and secretly more encouraging than she would ever admit to. She started teaching the children of ranch families in the valley in a room at St. Michael's when she was 16, and by the time she was 20, she was running what passed for a school in 3 counties. Samuel became the person at Pine Ridge that Cooper had always seemed to know he would be, the one who understood animals in the particular quiet way that some people do, who could read a horse's mood across a field and fix a problem before it became a crisis, who turned out to have his father's head for the ranch's logistics and his mother's absolute refusal to let anything fall apart on his watch. He became foreman at 22 and ran the operation with the particular combination of stubbornness and competence that Grace had been watching in him since he was 6 years old on a platform in Millhaven. Lucy grew up already knowing who she was the way children do who have always been fiercely loved. She had Grace's precision and Ethan's steadiness, and a gift for understanding people that neither of them could entirely account for. She took over the business side of Pine Ridge with an efficiency that made both her parents feel simultaneously proud and slightly inadequate, and she did it laughing because Lucy had always laughed easily, which Grace had always considered one of God's more merciful gifts. And Pine Ridge itself, the house Ethan had built too large for a man who thought he'd never fill it, became exactly what it had been built to be. Full. Loud at dinner. Marked by children's heights on the kitchen doorframe and a bay gelding named Cooper, who outlived every expectation and died peacefully at 23 years old in the care of the boy who had loved him since the first afternoon. One evening, years later, Grace sat on the porch steps, the same steps where she and Ethan had sat the night before the hearing the night they had decided, and watched the light go off the mountains and felt the solid weight of the life they had made. Ethan came out and sat beside her. Not the careful distance of that first night, beside her properly. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking. What about tonight?" She looked at the mountains. "About the platform," she said. "About how I thought that was the worst day of my life." "Was it?" "No." She turned to look at him. "It was the day everything changed." "That's different." He held her gaze with the steadiness that had not changed in all the years since a square in Millhaven where he'd stepped out of a crowd because he still knew right from wrong. That steadiness had not wavered. It had not dimmed. It had turned out to be exactly what it looked like, the real thing, plain and permanent, and entirely reliable. "Grace Callahan," he said quietly. "Ethan Callahan," she said back. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they sat while the light went completely, and the stars came out over Wyoming, and the house behind them was warm and full of the sounds of the family they had chosen one extraordinary, ordinary day at a time. A family is not given to you. It is not purchased. It is not assigned by blood or law or circumstance. It is built by people who look at each other in the hardest moments and choose again and again and again to stay. And that choice made faithfully and daily by people brave enough to mean it is the only foundation that never breaks.